Hello, students. Welcome to another video today with me, your host, William Wright, Professor Wright. Over today, we're covering chapter 17, which is the 17th and 18th centuries. And I repeat these things a lot, but that means it's the 16 and 1700s. And yes, this is from Living with Art by Mark Getline. And we finished up, chapter 16 wrapped up the Renaissance, which is from 1400 to 1600. And now chapter 17 is covering what will become known as the Baroque era. And the Baroque era it's just that shift towards the years after the Renaissance. We'll talk about what that means in a minute. But essentially, as we move to the 17th and 18th centuries, Europe is developing further and further. Colonialism is happening, right? So we see, number one, in Europe, we have the Age of Kings, right? There's this veneration, even more so, of the crown, and the crown becomes richer and richer and richer, and they become more and more different from regular people, which does eventually lead to some issues, as we'll talk about. But yeah, Frederick the Great, Maria Theresa of Austria, Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, all these greats. And then, of course, the Sun King, Louis of France. But in any case, that is happening alongside the development of colonies in America, colonies in the Caribbean and South America. I should say Jamestown is in the United States, and that's in 1607, so that's right after the end of the Renaissance. And then the Mayflower reaches Massachusetts in 1620, and that happens. There again, just right after the Renaissance. And then, various other places. The Pacific begins to be colonized. Africa and all the horrible things that come out of African colonization begin to happen. But in any case, we're going to look at the art from this time. And again, we're going to start with the Baroque, then hit Rococo, and then end with Revolution. Okay, so I found a funny meme. If it ain't Baroque, don't fix it. I like to say that the Baroque is extra, right? That was more relevant to say a few years ago, but I still say it. Baroque is extra. It's a lot, right? And remember, we're coming at the tail end of the Renaissance, where we saw this shift from the like subdued, really theoretical, really scientific Renaissance art to the like high Renaissance art to the late Renaissance mannerism that's very dramatic, very emotional. We already saw in Venice they were making art that was like a little more like sexual in nature of its nudes. It wasn't just nude figures for the fact of anatomy. It was something different. And we also see just the art of the Counter Reformation, which is big and emotional, trying to get people to come back from shifting to Protestant ideas that are away from the Catholic Church. But in any case, this gets us to the Baroque, all this dramatic shifting in style. In the Baroque, in a side by side, you should really remember this slide. Be sure you find these slides on Canvas and really look. The Renaissance is stoic, which means unemotional. It's subdued. It's restrained, scientific, and balanced, and evenly lit. Everything is equally visible. Versus right next to it, when we get to the Baroque, so you see the difference right here. It is full of motion. There's diagonals. There's things happening. There's emotion, right? So it's dramatic and effective. It is grand. It is theatrical, it is asymmetrical, and it is dramatically lit. So again, it's big. It is kind of storytelling, and then the asymmetry is a big part of it as well. And then, of course, dramatic lighting means just essentially there's higher contrast. We have the big dark darks and the bright brights. Sorry, we're setting my timer so I don't go over here because this is probably just going to be part one. But in any case, this dramatic shift in storytelling, right, through the art. Okay, and again, asymmetry versus balance, even light versus lights and darks. Let's take a look at what all that means. In any case, St. Peter's Basilica, this kind of allows us to transition right from the Renaissance. St. Peter's Basilica is being finished up as we end the Renaissance. Carlo Maderno lengthened the nave and created the new facade. I'm sorry, I've said previously that I guess Michelangelo designed it, but then he kept Maderno lengthened it and created a new facade. Bernini actually is the one responsible of redecorating the interior of the basilica, as well as designing this colonnade, this arcade out front, right? Essentially creating this front section of just a bunch of columns in an ellipse, right? And it's a big deal that it's an ellipse, it's an oval, it is not a circle, right? And Bernini is the guy responsible for that. We're going to talk more about Bernini. Basically, I just kind of think of Moderno as wrapping up what Michelangelo did and kind of adding a little Baroque flair, but then Bernini's the guy who took the Basilica into the Baroque. That's probably a bit reductive, but in any case, the Baroque is a dynamic, sometimes theatrical 17th century art style characterized by bold scale, dramatic use of light and color, elaborate ornamentation, emotion, energy, and motion. Gian Lorenzo Bernini was a painter, dramatist, composer, and sculptor, and he was the first guy we're going to talk about here in the Baroque, and he's really one of my all-time favorites. But yeah, he did this yard here, this elliptical colonnade. But in looking at his first actual like finished piece of sculpture, which I like to really highlight him as a sculptor, although his sketchbooks are amazing, his paintings are amazing, but I like to look at his sculpture. Let's first look at his rendition of David. A couple things I like to ask typically for students to tell me what's different, but I'll go ahead and lay out what I think is different. What we see shift in Bernini, right? We already saw with Michelangelo that we shifted from, Donatello's picture of the victorious David, kind of frolicky over the severed head of Goliath. Then that's Donatello's rendition, and Verrocchio's, and then Michelangelo creates this version of David where it's more subdued, right? And again, this kind of highlights the stoic nature. He's pensive, he's thinking about what he's about to do, and it's about to go down, right? It's the other one, the battle's already over with Donatello. Michelangelo, we're about to have the battle, we're thinking about the battle. It's all about the restraint, it's about the moment of power that's about to happen. And then Bernini, what I like to point out is it's happening. We're seeing it happen. He has loosed the rock, or is about to loose the rock, and we're in the middle of Goliath going down. The action is happening, and we see it through this like taut, like curve, this stretch of David's pose. He's biting his lip, clearly like getting after it, and then the way that the actual kind of sling is already kind of set. Either, like I said, it's either just let loose or it's about to let loose, and it just has a different feeling because we are in the middle of the action. It's storytelling. It's not just depiction of a man. It's the storytelling of what happened. Now, what else is happening here? I also want to note that Bernini has chosen in the Baroque to cover the nude parts of David, or he has chosen to depict David as at least somewhat clothed, right? That's an important shift as well. It's like kind of pulling back to a more. It's funny because while the Baroque is more dramatic, when depicting biblical characters, especially, or real people especially, they're clothed, right? Study of anatomy is limited to Greek myths and things like that. But in any case, yeah, that's Bernini's rendition of David. Now, another Bernini piece that kind of plays into what I was just talking about, the sort of interesting, like it's dramatic, but it's also like kind of prudish in a way picture, although not really even in this one. It's just, they don't do the biblical stories as nudes anymore. And one of the things that really highlights this is this amazing piece of Saint Teresa's In Ecstasy. This is it's a piece in Rome that Bernini did of this sort of angelic figure, I guess, venerating or vindicating Saint Teresa, as she abstains from, regular life and just devotes herself to being basically a nun or a saint, a saintly type figure. And in any case, this piece with its dramatic, the faces are very, very dramatic, but it's also got the drapery that's sort of posed in this like flowing, really heavy way. Her foot sort of hanging off of the edge here. The whole thing is suspended in space. The beams of light coming from the heavens are physical in nature. And then what I want to talk about, again, bouncing off of the interesting like play between drama and sort of not wanting to make it nudes in biblical art. There is definitely meant to be a sort of statement over the fact that the arrow held by this angelic figure is pointed in a very specific direction, and her face is definitely meant to. Essentially, what this sculpture is meant to say is how while the character abstained from physical pleasure, the the idea is that the angelic presence of God or the connection to God can fulfill ecstasy in a way, that overcomes the earthly desires, I guess. It's sort of that's all the subtle hint here, but it's not so subtle when you really dig in and think about this. But that's kind of an underplaying idea here, and that's a pretty interesting kind of shift again in the story being really over the top, but then the depiction of it being kind of more symbolic. In any case, in addition to that, we do see another piece. I put this one in here. It's not in the textbook, but it's actually the Rape of Proserpina, which is a piece by Bernini that I think is just one of the greatest sculptures of all time. The pose is dramatic. It is big. And this one has a little bit more lewdness to it, I guess you might say. But at the end of the day, these are Greek kind of mythological characters. It also does show you that we're getting back to depicting mythological kind of classical characters. But here we see Proserpina, trying to get away from her, mythological captor. And the greatest part of this piece is the way that the fingers go into the thigh. This is made of marble, and yet that thigh looks just like just a real person's hand squeezing into a real person's thigh, and the way that the fingers push in on the wrist. It's just an amazing piece of marble, and one of the reasons why Bernini is my favorite, and kind of getting to why the Baroque is quickly becoming one of my favorite times in art. Now, and his beard is majestic, the drapery is majestic, the kneecap and the calf, it's all just amazing. Now, in any case, that gets us through. That's Bernini, and like I said, he's also a famous painter and architect. But we also see some other architectural shifts as we look at the Baroque. This is a nephew of Maderno, the guy that kind of finished out the nave of the Basilica. Borromini creates this San Carlo alle Quattro Fontane in Rome, and it's a chapel that again it's no longer this square Romanesque full of arches facade. It is now this undulating, like curvy facade with little niche sculptures. It changes from level to level. It goes in and then it goes out, and then up at the top it's not squared at all. And it's also just sort of like stuck onto the side of this building, the facade, which is pretty crazy right here. And then the way that this shape in the top niche is actually an oval, which again, this is like a big deal. Shifting to the oval is a big deal in the Renaissance. And what we see here is looking at the top of this chapel is again the elliptical shape, and actually a very subtle kind of softened version of the cross, right? Which is that the actual building is now shaped a little bit like a soft cross, right? And again, the dome itself is elliptical, not circular. So pretty wild stuff there architecturally. Now, as we continue and we really dig in, that Bernini kind of hits sculpture and architecture, although he is a painter, like I said. Caravaggio hits with the big shift in Baroque painting that now takes it from being overdone mannerism to being now like really well thought out dramatic painting of the Baroque. And Caravaggio is basically credited for creating an idea called tenebrism, or really being one of the greatest to utilize the ideas of tenebrism, which is a dramatic or pronounced use of chiaroscuro, which means light and dark, remember, in which most of the figures are engulfed in shadow, but some are dramatically illuminated by light, kind of like my face right now. No, but I'm just seeing there's a big glare in the office right now. But in any case, um, this painting of the Entombment of Christ, we see we go from everything being evenly lit to big like spotlight, right? This is a light that's hitting uh, and pointing really dramatically at the figures, and then the further away the characters are from the center, the less lit up they are. And so, and then if something is blocking the light, the things behind it, you can't even see them at all, right? That it's a solid shadow, and this big contrast of dark and light is called tenebrism, this spotlight. Yeah, and again, another piece by Caravaggio. I'm kind of scooting over because I'm not even able to see the art right now. Caravaggio's Calling of St. Matthew here. I like to point out in this one that the light here, it's like a physical thing, right? It's literally in front of the head of this character, right? And as these characters are sort of seated at the table, what's interesting is just because it's dark does not mean that Caravaggio left it undone. He has these really subtle shapes, finishing the legs of the characters that aren't even really lit because the table's blocking them. And again, there's a dramatic scene. St. Matthew is being called forth, and the character's head is down, and I don't know. Just now, these guys don't at all. Let me point out that they don't at all look like characters like Saint, like I don't know, the timing of it. They look like modern Italian or yeah, European people. So kind of worth noting as well. They don't look like ancient characters, but in any case, the lighting is really what you should see here. The side of this character who's facing the light is very easy to see. The other sides are dark, and then there's lots of empty dark space in this piece because of the dramatic spotlighting. Now, yeah, now we're just to kind of, I don't know, compare and contrast again. This is, of course, the Northern Renaissance we're seeing. It's not really super accurate proportion, but you see there's a sort of lack of emotion. This is just to get an idea of Caravaggio and the Baroque right next to something from the Renaissance that's depicting the same story. But yes, this is. I think, yeah, it's Judith beheading Holofernes, and here in this Renaissance depiction, Judith is again a very modern Italian or a very modern European character who has no emotion. There's not even any blood. His head is just like chilling there on the table. It's no big deal, and it's like she's right in the center. There's a little bit of perspective with the window outside and all that stuff, but in the Baroque depiction of Caravaggio's depiction of Judith killing Holofernes, blood is spraying, the faces are emotional. Judith is sort of like, whoa, that's really happening. I'm really doing that. And again, they do still look very modern, but at the end of the day, they're sort of more ambiguous, and the drapery is sort of flowy and soft. Remember, they've completely shifted to using oil paint now, so it's just really luscious and like layered. And I don't know, in any case, the lighting dramatically affects this scene, and this sort of really encapsulates the Baroque, versus the Renaissance. Now, Caravaggio, you should know, is the painter of that dramatic tenebrism, but there are other artists who kind of also use tenebrism, and Caravaggio is just kind of one of the most famous. But another very famous artist who actually was working in the same, as far as I understand, her father worked in the studio of Caravaggio, and so there's probably some overlap there. There's definitely a genre like similarity, but in any case, Artemisia Gentileschi is one of the first Baroque female artists and deserves a lot of attention. Her story is pretty amazing. I would say you can go look it up, but I like to tell it, so I'm going to tell it. I'm going to go ahead and open up with just her story, then we'll read this. So essentially, Artemisia, by the time she's a teenager, is like known to be a prodigy. She's an amazing painter with a real gift, and she is actually accepted into the academy not only at a very young age, but it's a big deal because she is a female, right? And she's keeping up with the contemporaries. She's working hard. Her father was also an artist, like I said, and working in the Caravaggio studio. But in any case, at the academy, one of the instructors took a liking to Artemisia, and then I guess I should like TW trigger warning. You might skip ahead a couple minutes if you don't want to hear this story, although I've told similar ones prior to this. But in any case, Artemisia is basically becomes the victim of some sexual assault, sexual manipulation. She has a teacher that basically rapes or sexually abuses her, and after a couple years of this happening, her father, she wants to stay in the academy, so it's the classic like not making a big stink. But after a time, and I'm not an expert on all these details, but after a time, her father finds out, and he confronts the teacher and basically says like, look, he doesn't like it, but the best situation for his daughter is to have this teacher marry her, and kind of make sure that she doesn't end up being part of this dramatic. I hate to say this, but they were worried she'd be like damaged goods, that they called it out and stuff, and so they could set her up with this teacher, and then just all this drama happens, and teacher says yes and keeps kind of raping her, and then it just goes on, and in the end, the father says like, okay, this guy's not going to marry you. Do you want to do this? Do you want to take him to court? Artemisia says, yeah. Father agrees, and they go. And again, I'm paraphrasing a lot of this, but Artemisia and her father take him to court. And then as the courts worked in the 1600s, she ends up being tortured with thumb screws, which is basically like a clamp that they put around your thumbs. They also put it on her toes. And in a moment of like badassness, I'm going to cuss a little bit more in this video, but in a moment of awesomeness, I think at one point she's being tortured, and supposedly she turns to her rapist and says, thanks for the wedding rings, right? So there's this clamp on her thumb. She like jokes like, good wedding ring. It's an epic story, but she puts up with it. She deals with the torture. And then again, that's contemporary forensics. Essentially, they say like, well, hey, 7 months in this torture, she must be telling the truth. I guess he really did rape her. They find the artist guilty. And, of course, he doesn't really serve any time or anything, but at least she's vindicated. And then I guess one of the major, he does have some punishment, but she gets now this like cloud of having won the case. And now in a major win, the really big thing I like to point out is that what she wins is the right, when painting her version of Judith killing Holofernes, Judith and the maidservant, when Holofernes is being beheaded, she is actually permitted to use the rapist's face, the rapist's expression as Holofernes. So I don't know. I like to say, curse word warning here. Yeah, Artemisia didn't take no shit. She like got after it, and then she went on to make 57 artworks, and 94% of them, or 49 of these very famous artworks, feature women as the protagonists, as they're equal to or overpowering men, like Judith and her maidservant. These characters lack stereotypical feminine traits. They're not sensitive, they're not timid, and they are not weak. They are courageous, rebellious, and powerful. Pretty cool story. I like to tell it. I probably could have abbreviated it and had you go to Wikipedia, but it's pretty cool. So yeah, anyway, her artwork is central to the beginning of the Baroque. Alongside, there's Caravaggio, and now we talk about Rubens, who is actually Flemish. We've mostly talked about Italians thus far in the Baroque, but Rubens, who's Flemish, is basically like Amsterdam. It's Flanders, right? It's where Belgium and the Netherlands are. But here we see an altarpiece by Peter Paul Rubens. It's a little bit less tenebrism focus, right? Because, he's in Northern Europe, but it does have an overwrought. It's got the diagonal composition. It's got the like taut figures and the sort of overly muscular features and things like that. This sort of dimply baby butt going on over here. I don't know. And it's very layered and full and dramatic as Jesus is being raised up on the cross. And this style that's sort of soft, it's also not really real. It doesn't have that exact like drapery feel that we're getting in the Italian Baroque era. What we see is this sort of haziness and that over overdone, over musculatured figure, it actually becomes known as Rubenesque. It's a style of Rubens which is like plump, fleshy, voluptuous. It's really muscular or really soft and kind of, I don't know, the skin is almost like oily and greasy, and everybody has like a little bit extra skin. It's actually more real in some ways. And so this style, and again, it's oil painted, and so he has this sort of hazy glazing of layers, in addition to some drapery and things happening. And this just kind of style it becomes known as Rubenesque because Peter Paul Rubens really highlights this, again, like musculature and extra skin sort of idea. Now that was Northern Europe. Caravaggio's Italy. Now let's talk a little bit about Central Europe or France. Each country developed the Baroque principles in its own way. The French favored restraint and classical version where order and balance was maintained. This piece is actually a dramatic story of the Ashes of Phocion, done by Poussin. And it's basically the story, it's an ancient story of the king of a kingdom who is conquered and defeated, and when he is killed, or when he dies, his ashes, they're not permitted to be buried. His queen and their servants, they're not permitted to bury them in the traditional way. And actually, she ends up sneaking away the ashes, and they head out of the city that's been captured, and they bury the ashes of Phocion. Again, I think it's a older, like, Greek story, and Phocion gets the proper burial, and after having his remains snuck out. But what's happening here in terms of this visual, that big dramatic story of sneaking out the ashes of the defeated king and stuff, it's just a little thing happening right here. The overall idea of the Baroque here in France is this classical landscape, right? It's symmetrical. It's nearly symmetrical. It's not exact, but it's restrained. It is ordered and balanced, right? And so that's what we see here. Now, heading in further to the Baroque, I did say it's the Age of Kings, and all those guys are ruling, and lots of art is sort of dedicated to them. But really the only monarch that I talk about as sort of the center of figure of a Baroque movement is Louis the 14th, or the Sun King. He ascends to the throne in 1643 at the age of 4, takes control in 1661, reigns until 1715. He was venerated as the Sun King because they said, the world basically revolved around him. He had 2 ceremonies each day, one called the King's Lever, or the King's Getting Up, Lever, and then at night he would do the same ritual. Basically, half of the court would get up before him and make sure that they were in the room to witness him coming up, because it was the rising of the sun, and everybody had to be dressed and ready to take part, full pageantry. And then at night, the same group, or the other half, will get dressed up, and they play a ritual role in the King's Coucher, or the King's going to bed, right? The rising and setting of the sun. That's the idea. And he becomes, a whole life of being venerated as basically the center of everyone's world, leads him to being sort of very vainglorious. His brother is actually, in many military ways and in political ways, kind of, I wouldn't say superior, but he does a lot of the work, although they do have a very good relationship for most of their life. But in any case, now the big crowning achievement of the Sun King, in terms of his contribution to Baroque art, there's plenty of it, of paintings and portraits of Louis, but the big one is the Palace of Versailles. Now, the Palace of Versailles is this many square or probably square miles of forest and city. It's a city or it's a palace that supposedly would hold something like 10,000 troops at any given time. So it's really a city, right? And I think it maybe even at times held more than that, but it was meant to house several thousand military and kind of aristocratic guests. And the palace, it's done in the Baroque style. It's kind of beginning to look somewhat modern, but it's kind of the peak of the Baroque style of architecture. In some ways, we see the columns, we see the niche, the arches, but really, my favorite part of the Palace of Versailles is the grounds, right? This beautiful garden. You can just barely see it. It's in the back in this picture. There is a great big pond or lake that I got to walk all the way back to the back to, and it took all day. I spent so much more time walking around these woods and grounds, in the back than I did at the actual palace. But we see here the grounds. Now, keep in mind too, I think it's funny to think about in this 10,000 person filled palace, there were only, I think, like two bathrooms. So yeah, I've always heard there's stories that Louis they had to empty out the palace every so often to clean out all the places behind the stairwells and things like that where people would do their business. Now, probably rumor, but in any case, I think it's funny to think about that happening in the palace. So that's part of why I enjoyed the outside a little better. But in any case, the exterior, I also, yeah, there's many sculptures, and I wish I had uploaded a photo here, but there's a sculpture that Bernini did of Louis that supposedly was so accurate that Louis hated it. He did not like that he looked like himself, right? He wanted to be more magnificent, more heroic, and he ordered it destroyed, and then they convinced him, no, like let's just put it back in the garden so you can go see this beautiful Bernini uh, sculpture. And I think they ended up actually replacing the original figure anyway, or another sculptor, made it look more heroic. But in any case, yeah, these grounds are just a spectacular part of it. But of course, the jewel of it when you get into the interior of the Palace of Versailles is the Hall of Mirrors. Now, if you've ever seen the show Versailles, which is actually one of my favorites, this is the scene where when Louis is getting bad news, he's always sort of like prancing his way through the Hall of Mirrors, and this is where when he's hallucinating, he's always like frolicking with people in this. I don't know. You just have to see the show. It's a pretty interesting show, but this sort of ornate crystal and gold and just the mirrors, lining the walls. Just it's bright and shining. The mirrors everywhere is kind of very. There were also mirrors everywhere in the Graceland, Elvis's home. Fun fact: I've been there, and just I don't know, mirrors. Just to me, it says something about what the people thought of themselves. But yes, in any case, 1680, the Hall of Mirrors is finished, and it becomes sort of, it has this beautiful arched, like vaulted dome ceiling that's painted, and all these carved niches and things, which actually is a prelude to the Baroque. Which we'll talk about in a minute. But yeah, these crystal chandeliers are all a big deal. And then, of course, what I'm leading up to is the Hall of Mirrors is also very famous for another thing that happened there just over 100 years ago. The first semester I taught, I think it was the 100-year anniversary of the ending of World War I. It is here in 1919. Yeah, the Treaty of Versailles ends World War One, and they call it the Treaty of Versailles because this is where world leaders from Europe and the West got together and signed the treaty to end World War One and make Germany pay the reparations and all the things that then, of course, led to World War Two. But yeah, the Hall of Mirrors is where this happened. So pretty cool little tidbit of history. Now, before we kind of uh, continue on to the Rococo portion of this lecture, we should talk about in Spain. We haven't talked yet about how Spain has its own style of painting, and Diego Velázquez, in his painting Las Meninas, is a real indication of some of the difference. I really like to talk about all the subtle nuances. This is all about symbolism and intrigue and drama in this piece. I like to point out, one, we're looking at the maids of honor who are attending to the little princess of Spain that we see here. And the portrait is really of the Princess of Spain. But what we notice, first off, there's some drama here. We don't know what these two are thinking about or whispering about while they watch the maids attend to the princess. There's this man sort of awkwardly positioned on the stairs looking through. What is that? Is that some sort of hidden drama? Yeah, there's the dog and the other tenants. And then actually the big thing is that the painter painted himself in this. And the painter painted himself painting in this portrait of the princess. And in this portrait, we're watching the painter paint. We know he's painting because we can see the back of the canvas. And then what's interesting is that he's looking at us, right? He's looking at the viewer. Now, in the back, there's a mirror. And in this mirror, you can see what most people assume are King Philip IV and his wife, so the King and Queen of Spain. So it's not just a portrait of the princess, it's also a portrait of the King and Queen. and the artist. But then the artist here, is he painting? I don't know. I can't help but wonder what's the artist saying when he's making the viewer essentially be the king and queen, right? I don't know. There's got to be something there. And again, the intrigue that's happening in the back, we're not sure what all is happening, but this piece has gone through, the rigmarole of trying to get all the different hidden meanings and messages. But it's definitely indicative of, some artistic drama that's happening, in Spain as well, as part of its Baroque movement. Now, covering another area, this is in the Netherlands as well. So we've already covered Rubens, but there's some other things happening that are kind of church, right? Non-academic Baroque that are happening. And I like to highlight those here. Rembrandt is a portrait painter working in the Netherlands at the time of the Baroque, and he, in some ways, is kind of like Caravaggio. I think they call Rembrandt the painter of light. They call lots of people the painter of light, but he's a painter of light. He's definitely using tenebrism like Caravaggio, but it's different. It's not the exact like light and dark, high contrast. There's a little bit more fuzziness. That softness, not unlike Rubens, is here, right? And again, I think Rembrandt, they talk about real famously, would paint like every little detail, even in these super dark areas. But for the most part, Rembrandt was a portrait painter. And remember, portraiture, as we leave the Renaissance, is about regular people as much as it is about royals, right? Okay, so here we see Captain Banning Cook's company of the Civic Guard, the Night Watch, right? This is not a royal. I mean, he's somewhat a person of clout or an important figure, but the whole idea is that he's not a royal. He's not a aristocrat. This is a painting of just the Night Guard, in Dutch lands in the Baroque era. So he's Dutch Baroque, which is a little different. And this whole idea is that in the Dutch Baroque, we start to see more regular people painted. And that is what we call genre painting. All right, in its first iteration, we call genre painting, focusing on the scenes of everyday life. So that's what we saw the Captain Banning, his whole, it's the idea of his crew getting ready for the night watch. This is a scene of a painter painting, just a regular painter. This is a scene of a carousing couple here on the right. This is a man, playing violin. Funny enough, this man looks a lot like the guy who plays Louis XIV in the show Versailles. That's just me. But in any case, yes, these are scenes of everyday life, which is different than the big, highly, they're basically portraits of regular people. And that's different than the really over the top mythological or royal, that age of kings focus on royals and aristocrats that you see in the other types of art. And again, all these guys are kind of Dutch, and it's generally considered to be a Northern European thing, and it's probably, again, because of Protestantism spreading across Northern Europe. Now, of course, Rubens was Northern Europe as well, but in any case, we have academic church art and genre painting of regular people. Vermeer here, just a woman holding a balance, right? And he, of course, famously is possibly known for using a camera obscura and all this stuff. There's also a painting of a Last Judgment in the back of Vermeer's genre painting, just a regular woman wearing her jewelries and things. But Roysdale, another northern art. Basically, all of this is about the secularization of art. That's a good word. The secular art that is not the highly academic, spiritual, church-oriented art or king-oriented art. Remember, when they venerate the king, they are venerating the church in many ways because the king's, ordained and stuff. But in any case, here's a Roysdale painting of Uitmarsum. It's a view of a city, and this is just the whole point of this is it's just a view of a city. It's just a regular landscape. There are people here in the back, in the foreground, but they're just regular people. They're hurting. There's no mythology. There's no story. We've now moved to know people that are important in the landscape. And right, that whole idea of like it's not Christian at all, it's not spiritual at all, is a big deal. Okay, that gets us to the Baroque, which I think is a good place to end part one. So I'm going to hit pause here, and we're going to do part 2 of chapter 17 in another video. So we'll talk to you.